I wanted to tell two stories, and both of them have the same characters, same basic setting, and two different takes on one theme. The first one is very well known. It's case 35 of the Blue Cliff record. And it takes place between a monk named Wuzhao and Manjushri. And the setting is Mount Wutai. This is in China. And Mount Wutai, whenever you hear mountain in these stories, it refers to an actual mountain, but it actually refers to a monastery. So Wutai is the monastery on Mount Wutai. And the monk, Wuzhao, decides to go there. And everyone knows that Mount Wutai is where Manjushri likes to hang out. He's not there all the time, but he kind of appears occasionally. So if in your lifetime you were to see Manjushri, which would be really exciting, this was where you would go. So Wuzhou goes. And it isn't clear in the story, but we can kind of assume that at least part of why he's going is because you would want to see Manjushri, you would want to see the bodhisattva of wisdom face to face. So he goes up the mountain to the monastery, and when he arrives there, who is sitting there but Manjushri? It's perfect. And Manjushri greets him and says, and I'm going to read this for you. He says, "Where have you recently come from?" And Wuzhou says, "From the south." "How is Southern Buddhism faring?" asked Manjushri. Or sometimes I've also read this as, "How is the practice in the south?" And then Wuzhou says, "The monks of the latter days of the law observe the Buddha's precepts a little." Manjushri asks, "Are there many or few?" And Wuzhou says, "Here about 300, there about 500. Then Wuzhou turns around and asks to Manjushri, "How does Buddhism fare in your part of the world?" Manjushri replies, "The worldly and the holy are living together. Dragons and snakes are mingled." Wuzhou asks, "Are there many or few?" And Manjushri says, "The former threes and threes, the latter threes and threes." There's a lot to be said about this. All the koans have a lot of layers, and the numbers matter. Some of the specifics matter. So I'm going to give you my surface understanding of this koan, which is that Wuzhou goes and he meets Manjushri, and Manjushri asks him, "Where are you from?" He says, "I'm from the south." And Manjushri's like, "Well, how's Buddhism in the south?" This is the moment when Wuzhou misunderstands the assignment. Right? He takes this stance as if he's not there, as if he's not from the south, and he starts saying, "Well, it's kind of like this. They're doing this. They're doing their best." This is like if you came to me and I said, "What do you do?" And you said, "Well, I'm a dancer." And I said, "Where are you from?" And you said, "Cape Breton." And I said, "How do they dance in Cape Breton?" And then you said, "Oh, it's kind of like Irish dancing, but the hands are a little bit different, and we wear this instead of this." And that's not the answer. I'm asking you how you dance. I'm asking you to show me. Not to get in your head, not to describe it to me, not to tell me what you think you know, but to show me what you actually know. Manjushri says, "How's Buddhism in the south?" Wuzhao is from the South. He is Buddhism in the South. He can show it's like this, but he doesn't. He misses it. He goes into his head. He goes into his opinions. He goes into his evaluations of things. And then Manjushri gives him another chance. And he says, are there many or few? And again, Wuzhao is not thinking. A, because Manjushri probably knows the answer. B, because why would Manjushri care? But he gives the answer. Because he knows that there are about 300 over here and there are about 500 over here. But he also knows something is up. Maybe he doesn't know exactly what he missed, but he knows he missed something. He knows that something is happening. And so he turns around and he asks the same questions back. And he says to Manjushri, how is Buddhism here? In your world? And Manjushri says, the worldly and the holy are living together. Dragons and snakes are mingled. So he's taking images of things that seem opposite. He's saying there's no tension. There's no opinion. There's no good. There's no bad. There's no success. There's no failure. It is what it is. And it's vast. And then Wuzhao says, are there many or few? And then he gives this, and again, there's more to be said about this. He gives this kind of what sounds like a nonsensical response. He says the former 3s and 3s, the latter 3s and 3s. So he offers numbers, but the numbers don't mean anything. He turns everything Wuzhao said upside down. He takes away the idea of a knowledge that is quantifiable, that can be verbalized, and just leaves questions. I tell this story because a month or so ago, I gave another talk and I was talking about knowing. I was saying there are things that we do know. There are things that we know and that we can trust that we know. And a little while after that, a question came to me, and the question was, you're talking about knowing, but most of the time we're talking about not knowing. We're saying that this whole practice is a practice of not knowing. How do we reconcile these two things? How do we navigate both, if both can work at the same time? And so I start with this story because this is a story about different kinds of knowing. One is the kind of knowing we all think of as knowing. Right? We can expound on so many things. We can expound on our political views. We have ideas about why this movie is good and this movie is bad, and we can explain them. And it's fun to explain them. It's fun to talk about our ideas. It's fun to explain our own internal math. It's fun to make a case for something, to convince someone. It's fun to think that we might show them something they haven't thought about yet, and then we can say, that's right. And as we do it, as we go through that process with another person, we're going through it with ourselves, and we're convincing ourselves again, more deeply of whatever it is that we're saying. And so the knowing that we carry often is something that is quantifiable. It is something that can be verbalized. It's a story in which we measure something, good or bad, and we explain why. And yet in this story, there is the other kind of knowing. Wuzhao is asked, he's invited to show what he knows about the practice, not to describe it, to just be it. He misses that moment, but it doesn't mean he doesn't know. He does know. He just doesn't know that that's the knowledge that matters. So that's one story between Wuzhao and Manjushri. And for the second story, we fast forward in time. And I don't remember if it's months or years. I suspect years, because in the second story, Wuzhao has become the cook in the temple, which is a fairly esteemed position. And he's working in the kitchen. He hasn't seen Manjushri for a long time. And he's stirring this big pot of soup. And out of the pot of soup comes Manjushri. This ghostly, magnificent figure rises up out of the soup. And he starts talking to Wuzhao. And what does Wuzhao do? Before Manjushri can even get a question out, he beats Manjushri with the spoon. He beats him back until he leaves. And then he turns to someone else in the kitchen and he says, I would have done the same if it had been the Buddha himself. I love this story. Because by the time we arrive at this story, Wuzhao knows what he knows. He knows what he's doing. He literally knows what he's doing. He's making soup. He doesn't need Manjushri for that. He doesn't need some magical otherworldly being of wisdom for that. He just needs to stir the soup. It's his job. The Bodhisattva of wisdom appears to talk to him. And this time he knows this conversation, whatever this conversation is, this isn't what I'm doing right now. Being in this other being's presence is not important to what I'm doing right now. Hearing what this being is saying is not important to what I'm doing right now. My big idea that will impress Manjushri is not important to what I'm doing right now. What I'm doing right now is this. So he beats him with a spoon. This is another way to talk about knowing. Partly it's about this simple question of what is in front of me. And making that primary. But partly it's about vow, in the way that we so often talk about vow. When we understand vow, and I don't mean understand in a cognitive way, when we have felt vow in our lives, when we notice vow in our lives, we're also able to notice what is and isn't in alignment with it. Maybe we can't articulate that. Maybe we can't articulate why this fits and this doesn't. Maybe we can't always articulate why we think we need to turn right instead of left. But there's something we know. And that knowing matters, even in this tradition that talks about not knowing. The not knowing, for the purposes of this conversation, in some ways is about not knowing what happens next. It's about not knowing the universals. You look at this moment, you look at what you're doing right now, and you check in with that vow, and you say, I'm going to go this way. But based on that decision, you don't form a thesis. You don't start to write an essay in your head about how now you're always going to go this way, and here's why. You go this way because this way is true in this moment, and in the next moment, you check again. You check what you know inside this huge range of what you don't know. And in doing that, in staying close to that question of what am I doing right now? What am I doing right now? What is my task right now? You're able to cut through this other instinct to form the whole thing into a paragraph, to write it up as an article, to come to some sort of airtight conclusion that you can file away and then pull up later the next time someone asks the question. You say, oh, I figured this one out a long time ago. I figured this out last month. I already know the answer. I don't need to look at it now. I just need to flip through my little notebook. Wuzhao, in this span of time, moves from someone who wants to impress Manjushri to someone who doesn't care at all what the Bodhisattva of wisdom thinks of him. He does this in the presence of Manjushri. He does this by doing the same practice he showed up with. There's no conflict here. There's just this process of maturity, this process of letting go of a story, this process of letting go of your perception and someone else's perception, and resting in that thing that maybe you don't know how to describe. We can call it trust if we want to, instead of knowing. We can call it paying attention instead of knowing. We all have it. And we all have the other thing as well. So I leave you with this question, which is, what is your Manjushri? What is that thing that pulls you into your head? What is that thing that if you were to beat it over the head with a spoon, you could finally just get back to the task at hand? I'm betting you might have that too. And I'll stop there.